The morning sun cast a warm glow over the small suburban neighborhood as the bride-to-be stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the delicate lace veil that had once belonged to her grandmother. The peaceful streets were already buzzing with activity as friends and family members scurried about, carrying chairs, arranging flowers, and transforming the modest backyard into a dream wedding venue. The couple had chosen to hold their wedding at home, not just to save money, but because this little house held special meaning for them. It was where they had shared their first meal together, where he had proposed on a rainy evening, and where they planned to build their future. Their story wasn't one of extravagant luxury. It was a tale of two ordinary people who had found extraordinary love in the most unexpected place. The bride's best friend was helping her with the final touches of her makeup, while her mother fussed over the dress, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. In the kitchen, aunts and cousins were putting finishing touches on homemade dishes, filling the house with the comforting aromas of familiar family recipes. The atmosphere was charged with joy and anticipation. Outside, white tents had been erected the previous day, their billowing fabric creating an ethereal atmosphere in the backyard. Strings of fairy lights were woven through the trees, ready to transform the space into a magical wonderland once evening fell. Paper lanterns in soft pastel colors swayed gently in the breeze, and mason jars filled with wildflowers lined the makeshift aisle. The groom, meanwhile, was in the garage with his father and best man, adjusting his bow tie for the 100th time. His hands trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the overwhelming happiness of knowing that in just a few hours he would be married to the love of his life. His father patted his shoulder, sharing a knowing look that spoke of his own wedding day decades ago. Children from the neighborhood had gathered at the fence, watching the preparations with wide-eyed wonder. Some of the younger ones had never seen a wedding before, and to them, it was like a fairy tale coming to life in their own backyard. The bride's mother occasionally shooed them away good-naturedly, but secretly enjoyed their excitement. As the morning progressed, cars began filling the quiet street. Guests arrived carrying gifts wrapped in shimmering paper and heartfelt cards. The couple had decided to keep the guest list small, just 60 of their closest friends and family members. This intimate setting meant everyone present had played a meaningful role in their journey together. The wedding coordinator, who was actually the bride's cousin doing this as her wedding gift, rushed around with a clipboard, checking and double-checking every detail. She had organized everything meticulously, from the timing of the ceremony to the seating arrangement that carefully considered old family dynamics and friendships. In the kitchen, the bride's grandfather was telling anyone who would listen about how he had married his wife with nothing but $5 in his pocket and a borrowed suit. His stories, though heard 100 times before, seemed especially poignant today. The older generation watched the preparations with misty eyes, remembering their own wedding days and marveling at how times had changed. The backyard transformation was nearly complete. Simple wooden chairs were arranged in neat rows, with small bouquets of locally grown flowers tied to the end of each row. A handmade arch, crafted by the groom and his father, stood at the end of the aisle. It was draped with flowing fabric and intertwined with roses and baby's breath. The arch wasn't perfect. One side was slightly higher than the other, but that small imperfection made it all the more special. Musicians, friends from the couple's college days, were setting up their instruments in the corner. They had practiced for weeks to perfect the bride's favorite songs. The soft sounds of their rehearsal drifted through the air, adding to the growing excitement. As noon approached, the temperature began to rise, but the forecast promised a perfect spring day. Neighbors who hadn't been invited were discreetly peeking over their fences, drawn by the joyful atmosphere. Some had even dressed up for the occasion, as if they were attending from afar. The bride's young niece, designated as the flower girl, was practicing her walk down the aisle, taking her role very seriously. She scattered imaginary petals and corrected her posture just as she had been taught, making everyone who watched break into smiles. The caterers arrived with the wedding cake, a simple 3-tiered creation decorated with fresh flowers. It wasn't the most elaborate cake, but it was made with love by a local baker who had known the bride since she was a child. The cake topper was vintage, borrowed from the groom's parents, adding another layer of family history to the celebration. Inside the house, final preparations were underway. The bride's dress hung on a door, catching the light and making the beaded details shimmer. Photo frames lined the hallway, showing the couple's journey from their first date to the proposal. Each picture told a story, and guests paused to look at them as they made their way through the house. The anticipation in the air was almost tangible. Everything was coming together perfectly: the weather, the decorations, the timing. No one could have predicted how this beautiful beginning would lead to such an unexpected turn of events. But for now, in these precious morning hours, there was only joy, love, and the excited flutter of hearts looking forward to witnessing two people commit their lives to each other. The scene was set for what everyone believed would be a perfect celebration of love. The small neighborhood had never seen such a beautiful transformation of an ordinary backyard. It was proof that you didn't need an expensive venue or elaborate decorations to create something magical. All you needed was love, family, and a community coming together to celebrate. As the clock ticked closer to the ceremony time, there was a sense that this would be a day to remember. Indeed it would be, but for reasons no one could have possibly imagined as they went about their joyful preparations on that bright spring morning. The wedding ceremony was about to begin when the unexpected guest appeared at the edge of the backyard. The neighbor from next door stood there, swaying slightly, with her infant daughter cradled in her arms. She wasn't dressed for a wedding. She wore what looked like yesterday's clothes, her hair uncombed, and her eyes carrying dark circles beneath them. Several guests noticed her before she made her way into the gathering. She had been pacing along the fence line for nearly 20 minutes, muttering to herself and occasionally looking up at the decorated backyard with an expression that was hard to read. Her baby was wrapped in a thick blanket despite the warming spring day. The bride's aunt was the first to spot her from the kitchen window, where she had been arranging appetizer platters. She pointed her out to others, and soon whispered conversations spread through the gathering. Everyone knew this neighbor. She had moved in 3 years ago with her husband, but lately she had become increasingly withdrawn from the community. Some of the older guests remembered how she used to be, always ready with a friendly wave, tending to her garden and chatting over the fence. But things had changed after her baby was born. The lights in her house would be on at odd hours, and sometimes people would hear her crying. Her husband had started spending more time at work, and she was rarely seen outside anymore. As she made her way into the wedding setup, guests could see she was trembling. The baby was unusually quiet, making only occasional whimpering sounds. A few people exchanged worried glances. Something didn't feel right about this situation. The neighbor's appearance at an event she hadn't been invited to was concerning enough, but her demeanor set off alarm bells. The groom's mother, always the diplomatic one, approached her first. She spoke softly, asking if everything was all right, but the neighbor seemed to look right through her. She clutched her baby tighter and moved further into the crowd of guests. Her movements were jerky and uncertain, like someone walking in their sleep. The wedding coordinator tried to handle the situation discreetly. She approached the neighbor and gently explained that this was a private ceremony. The neighbor's response was barely audible, something about needing to be there, needing to see everything. Her words didn't quite make sense, and her eyes had a glossy, faraway look. The baby started to fuss then, making small distressed sounds. Several guests who were parents themselves noticed that the blanket was wrapped too tightly, and the poor child was likely overheated in the warming spring air. One guest, a pediatric nurse, took a particular interest in the situation, her professional instincts kicking in. The neighbor began to walk between the rows of chairs, speaking in a low voice to her baby. Guests tried to give her space while keeping a watchful eye. Some of them knew about her struggles with the transition to motherhood, how she had withdrawn from her usual activities and friends. There had been rumors about her mental health, but in their small community, such things were often whispered about rather than addressed directly. As more guests arrived for the ceremony, the situation became increasingly tense. The neighbor's presence created an undercurrent of unease that threatened to overshadow the joyful occasion. She would stand still for long moments, then suddenly move to a different spot, always holding her baby close to her chest. The bride, still inside the house making final preparations, was unaware of the situation developing in her backyard. Her bridesmaids had noticed the commotion but decided not to worry her just yet. They hoped the situation would resolve itself before the ceremony began. The neighbor's husband had been called by one of the guests who had his number. He wasn't answering his phone. Later, they would learn he was in an important meeting, his phone silenced. This small detail would haunt him in the days to come. The baby's whimpers were growing more frequent now, and the neighbor's behavior became increasingly erratic. She started talking more loudly, though her words were still difficult to understand. She spoke about noise and parties and how no one understood what it was like. Her voice would rise and fall unpredictably. Several guests with medical backgrounds had begun to gather near the house, quietly discussing the situation. They recognized signs of a mental health crisis unfolding, but were unsure how to intervene without making things worse. The baby's distress was becoming more apparent, and this added urgency to their concerns. The wedding coordinator was now on her phone, standing behind the catering tent, having a hushed conversation with emergency services. She was trying to explain the situation without causing alarm. There was a disturbed woman with an infant. The behavior was concerning but not yet threatening, but something needed to be done before the situation escalated. The neighbor seemed to sense the attention she was drawing. She began to move more quickly through the gathering, her movements becoming more unpredictable. The baby's cries were now clearly distressed, but she only held the child tighter, shushing with increasing intensity. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. The beautiful spring day that had promised such joy now felt heavy with apprehension. The fairy lights and flowers, so cheerful just hours before, seemed to mock the seriousness of the situation developing beneath them. What had started as an unexpected appearance was quickly becoming something more concerning. The neighbor's presence was no longer just an awkward interruption, it was a situation that needed immediate attention. But no one could have predicted just how drastically things were about to change. The clock was ticking toward the ceremony's scheduled start time, and decisions needed to be made. Should they proceed with the wedding? Should they wait for help to arrive? The weight of these questions hung in the air, while the neighbor continued her uncertain movements through the crowd, holding her baby ever tighter, moving like a lost soul through what should have been a scene of pure celebration. Little did anyone know that these tense moments were just the beginning of a day that would change their community forever. The quiet spring afternoon was about to take a turn that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present, transforming a day of celebration into something entirely different. The wedding ceremony was just beginning when the baby's cries grew louder, piercing through the gentle music that had started playing. The neighbor, still clutching her infant tightly, had positioned herself near the makeshift altar. She stood there, swaying back and forth, her eyes fixed on the decorated arch as if she was seeing something no one else could. Several guests tried to approach her quietly, offering to help with the increasingly distressed baby. "Let me take her inside where it's cooler," whispered one elderly woman who had raised 4 children of her own. But the neighbor shook her head violently, backing away from every offered hand. "We need to stay," she kept saying. "We need to see everything. Everything needs to be witnessed." The baby's face had turned red from crying, tiny hands pushing against the tight blanket. The pediatric nurse who had been watching earlier couldn't stay silent anymore. She stepped forward, speaking in her calm professional voice. "Your baby is overheated," she explained gently. "Please, let's unwrap the blanket at least." But this only made the neighbor more agitated. She turned away, pressing the crying infant closer to her chest. The wedding party was now gathered at the back of the house, the bride peering out through a window at the scene unfolding in her backyard. Her face showed concern rather than anger. She had known this neighbor back when things were different, had shared garden tips and morning coffee with her. Seeing her like this, confused and frightened, broke her heart. The groom's father, a retired police officer, tried to take control of the situation. He approached slowly, hands visible, voice steady and calm. "Ma'am," he began, "we want to help you. Whatever's troubling you, we can talk about it." His training told him this was a crisis situation, but his heart ached for the young mother who clearly needed help. The neighbor's response was unexpected. She began to speak rapidly about noise violations, about how the music from the houses nearby kept her baby awake at night, about how no one understood what it was like to hear everything, feel everything. Her words tumbled out in a confused jumble, mixing past and present, real and imagined grievances. The baby's cries had become weak whimpers now, which worried the medical professionals in the crowd even more. The spring day had grown warmer, and the thick blanket was clearly causing distress. The neighbor kept pacing, her movements becoming more erratic. She would stop suddenly, stare into space, then start moving again, all while maintaining that tight grip on her infant. Some guests had quietly moved their chairs back, creating space around the troubled woman. Others were on their phones, some calling her husband again, others speaking in hushed tones to emergency services. The wedding coordinator was trying to maintain calm, quietly asking people to stay seated to avoid any sudden movements that might escalate the situation. The neighbor's voice grew louder as she continued her confused monologue. "The music never stops," she cried out. "Day and night, through the walls, through the windows. It gets inside my head. Inside the baby's head. We can't sleep. We can't think. Nobody listens. Nobody helps." Her words reflected a mind in chaos, mixing reality with delusion. The bride's grandfather, known for his gentle way with troubled souls, slowly made his way toward her. He had worked as a counselor before retiring, and something in his peaceful demeanor seemed to catch the neighbor's attention. She actually stopped pacing for a moment, looking at him with tears in her eyes. "I hear you," he said softly. "It must be very hard, feeling like no one understands." For a brief moment, something shifted in the neighbor's expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even relief at being heard. But then the baby moved in her arms, and the moment was gone. Her face hardened again, and she backed away from the kind old man. The temperature continued to rise as noon approached. The baby's whimpers had become alarmingly soft, and the neighbor's behavior grew increasingly unpredictable. She would calm for a moment, then suddenly become agitated again, her mood shifting like a leaf in the wind. The guests watched helplessly as the situation spiraled further out of control. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. Someone had finally made the difficult decision to call the police, realizing that this was beyond what the gathered friends and family could safely handle. The sound seemed to trigger something in the neighbor. Her eyes widened, and she clutched the baby even tighter. "No," she said, her voice rising. "No one can take her. No one understands. The noise, the lights, the people watching, they're all part of it. We have to stay. We have to witness." Her words made little sense, but the fear in her voice was real and raw. The wedding guests were now faced with a terrible dilemma. The ceremony was clearly impossible to begin, but any movement or change seemed to upset the neighbor more. The baby needed help. This was clear to everyone, but every attempt to offer assistance only made the situation worse. The bride, still watching from the window, had tears running down her face, not for her interrupted wedding, but for the woman she had once known as a friendly neighbor, now lost in some private nightmare. The groom stood beside her, holding her hand, both of them feeling helpless as they watched the scene unfold. Time seemed to slow down. The cheerful decorations, the flowers, the ribbons, the twinkling lights, now seemed to mock the seriousness of the situation. The spring breeze that had earlier carried the scent of roses now felt oppressive and still. Everyone could sense that something had to give, that this tension couldn't continue much longer. As the police sirens grew closer, the atmosphere became electric with anxiety. The neighbor's eyes darted around like a trapped animal's, her breathing becoming more rapid. The baby had grown eerily quiet. The wedding guests, who had gathered to celebrate love and new beginnings, found themselves instead witnessing a tragedy in the making. No one could have predicted how the next few moments would unfold. The peaceful suburban backyard, decorated for joy and celebration, was about to become the scene of something far different. The warm spring day that had dawned so full of promise was teetering on the edge of disaster, and everyone present could feel it in their bones. The approach of authority figures would soon trigger a series of events that would change everything, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. But for now, they all held their breath, hoping against hope that somehow this situation would resolve peacefully, that both mother and child would receive the help they so desperately needed. The moment the police cars turned onto the quiet suburban street, everything changed. The neighbor's face contorted with fear as the sirens grew louder, and she began backing away toward the garden fence. The baby, who had been eerily quiet, started making small distressed sounds again. 2 police officers approached the backyard carefully, having been briefed about the delicate situation. They were in uniform but moved slowly, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. The female officer took the lead, her hands visible and her voice gentle as she called out to the neighbor. "We're here to help," she said softly. "We just want to make sure you and your baby are safe." But these words seemed to have the opposite effect. The neighbor's eyes grew wild with panic, and she pressed herself against the fence, holding her baby so tightly that several guests gasped in concern. During the exchange of vows, the neighbor had suddenly found her voice. "Stop," she screamed, interrupting the ceremony. "Stop pretending everything is normal. Can't you all see what's happening?" Her words echoed across the backyard, causing the baby to startle and cry out in distress. The officers exchanged worried glances. They could see the baby's face turning an alarming shade of red, both from crying and from being held too tightly in the heat. The male officer spoke into his radio, requesting medical backup. The sound of static and voices from the radio made the neighbor more agitated. "The signals," she cried out. "They're everywhere. In the music, in the radio waves, in the lights." She gestured wildly with one hand toward the decorative string lights overhead, while still clutching her baby with the other. "They're trying to get into our heads. They want to control us all." The bride's grandfather tried one more time to reach out to her. "Nobody here wants to control you," he said gently. "We're all worried about you and your little one. Please, let us help." For a brief moment, something flickered in the neighbor's eyes. Recognition, perhaps even a glimmer of trust. But then a police radio crackled again, and the moment was lost. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The neighbor, believing she was cornered, made a sudden move toward the gap between the fence and the catering tent. In her panic, she knocked over a table of glasses, sending them crashing to the ground. The sound of shattering glass seemed to trigger something in her mind. "See," she screamed. "Everything is breaking. Everything is falling apart." She began to run, stumbling between chairs and decorations, still holding her baby in that terrible tight grip. Guests scrambled to get out of her way, while the police officers tried to maintain calm and control of the situation. The baby's cries had become worryingly weak. The pediatric nurse who had been watching the situation called out in alarm. "The baby needs air. She's holding her too tight." But her professional concern only added to the neighbor's paranoia. "You can't take her," the neighbor sobbed, now backing herself into a corner formed by the house and the fence. "Nobody can take her. We have to stay together. We have to witness it all." Her words made no sense, but the fear in her voice was heartbreakingly real. The police officers were now coordinating with newly arrived backup units, trying to figure out how to contain the situation without causing harm to either the mother or her baby. They had dealt with mental health crises before, but the presence of an infant made everything more complicated and dangerous. The wedding guests watched in horrified silence as the scene unfolded. The beautiful decorations that had been put up with such care now seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. Paper lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, casting shifting shadows over the chaos below. The bride, who had been watching from inside, couldn't stand it anymore. Despite protests from her family, she stepped out onto the back porch, still in her wedding dress. The neighbor's eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, something shifted in her expression. "I remember when you first moved in," the bride said softly. "Remember how we used to share coffee in the morning? How we talked about planting a vegetable garden together?" She took a small step forward, her white dress catching the sunlight. "I miss those talks. I miss my friend." For a brief moment, it seemed like the bride's words might break through. The neighbor's grip on her baby loosened slightly, and tears began rolling down her cheeks. But then a police radio crackled again, and the moment shattered like the broken glasses on the ground. The neighbor's face hardened once more, and she began backing away, moving toward the side of the house. "You're all part of it," she said, her voice rising. "The wedding, the lights, the music, it's all a signal. A sign. We have to stay and witness it all." The police officers were now positioning themselves strategically, trying to prevent her from fleeing while being careful not to make her feel trapped. The baby had grown alarmingly quiet, and the medical professionals among the guests were becoming increasingly concerned. The tension in the air was unbearable. What had started as a joyous celebration had transformed into a scene of crisis. The warm spring day seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Nobody could have predicted how the next few moments would unfold, or how this day would be forever marked in their memories. The neighbor, now cornered but still defiant, held her baby like a shield against the world. Her eyes darted between the faces around her, seeing threats where there were only concerned friends and neighbors. The police officers took another careful step forward, and everyone could sense that the situation was about to reach its breaking point. Little did they know that the worst was yet to come. The next few minutes would change everything, leaving an indelible mark on their community and transforming what should have been a day of celebration into something entirely different. The warm spring afternoon hung suspended in time, waiting for the next moment that would tip everything into chaos. What happened next would haunt everyone present for years to come. The neighbor, cornered and increasingly panicked, made a desperate dash toward the side gate. The police officers moved quickly but cautiously, aware of the precious cargo she carried. In her rush to escape, she tripped over a string of fairy lights that had fallen across the path. Time seemed to slow down as she stumbled. The baby, already weakened from being held too tightly in the heat, made no sound as the neighbor clutched her even closer, trying to regain her balance. The pediatric nurse noticed immediately that something was wrong. The infant's color had changed, and her tiny limbs had gone limp. "The baby," someone shouted. "She's not breathing." The words sent a wave of panic through the crowd. The police officers, who had been trying to maintain a careful distance, now had no choice but to act immediately. They rushed forward as the neighbor, still holding her child in a death grip, pressed herself against the fence. The female officer reached them first. "Please," she begged, her professional demeanor cracking as she saw the baby's condition. "Let us help your little one. She needs air. She needs medical attention right now." For a brief moment, maternal instinct seemed to break through the neighbor's confused state. She looked down at her baby's face, and horror flickered across her features. The bride's grandfather had managed to get close enough to speak softly to the neighbor. "You love your baby," he said gently. "I can see how much you love her. Right now, your baby needs help. Let these people help her." His calm, steady voice seemed to reach something deep inside the troubled woman. The neighbor's grip finally loosened. The male officer carefully took the baby while his partner supported the now collapsing mother. The pediatric nurse rushed forward immediately, her training kicking in as she began to assess the infant. The baby was unresponsive, her skin hot to the touch and showing signs of oxygen deprivation. Everything happened very quickly after that. The paramedics, who had been standing by, rushed in with their equipment. They worked with swift efficiency, their practiced movements a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded this moment. The baby was placed on a small stretcher, looking impossibly tiny against the white medical equipment. The neighbor, now separated from her child, seemed to collapse in on herself. The wild energy that had driven her actions drained away, leaving behind a confused and frightened woman. She kept asking in a small voice, "Is she breathing? Please, is my baby breathing?" The female officer held her gently, speaking soft words of comfort even as her own eyes filled with tears. The wedding guests stood in stunned silence as the paramedics worked. The beautiful decorations that had been put up with such care now seemed like props in a tragedy. The soft music that had been playing for the ceremony had long since stopped, replaced by the urgent voices of medical professionals and the sound of emergency equipment. The bride, still in her wedding dress, had moved to stand near the neighbor. Despite everything that had happened, her face showed only concern and compassion. She reached out and took the neighbor's hand, holding it firmly as they both watched the paramedics work on the baby. The simple human gesture seemed to anchor the neighbor, who had begun to tremble violently. Time became measured in heartbeats as the paramedics performed CPR on the tiny form. Each compression seemed to echo across the suddenly silent backyard. The nurse who had first noticed the baby's distress stood nearby, ready to assist if needed, her professional calm masking her deep concern. The neighbor's husband arrived just as they were loading the baby into the ambulance. He had finally checked his phone and seen the numerous missed calls. He rushed through the gate, his face pale with shock as he took in the scene, his wife being gently restrained by police officers, the paramedics working urgently, the wedding decorations scattered and broken around them. The ambulance sirens started up, their wail cutting through the warm spring air. The neighbor began to cry, deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from her very soul. Her husband wrapped his arms around her, his own tears falling as he tried to understand what had happened. The police officers explained that they would need to take her to the hospital as well, for evaluation and treatment. As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens fading into the distance, a heavy silence fell over the gathering. The bride and groom stood together, their wedding day transformed into something entirely different than what they had planned. But there was no anger on their faces, only deep sadness and concern for their neighbor and her baby. The wedding guests began to move slowly, picking up overturned chairs and gathering scattered decorations. But their hearts weren't in it. Their minds were with the tiny patient in the ambulance, racing against time toward the hospital. The day that was supposed to be filled with joy and celebration had become a lesson in how quickly life can change, how fragile the boundary is between happiness and tragedy. The police officers spoke quietly with the family, gathering information and explaining what would happen next. They handled the situation with remarkable sensitivity, understanding that this was not a case of malice but of illness, of a mother lost in the maze of her own mind until tragedy struck. As the warm afternoon began to fade, the backyard stood in disarray. A half-decorated wedding venue transformed into the scene of an emergency. But more than the physical chaos, it was the weight of what had happened that hung heavy in the air. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something that would stay with them forever, a reminder of how quickly joy can turn to sorrow and how mental illness can destroy lives when left untreated. The sun continued its path across the sky, indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded beneath it. But for those present, the day had become a dividing line. There would forever be before this moment and after. As the last emergency vehicles pulled away, leaving behind only the echo of their sirens, everyone knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The hospital waiting room filled with an unusual mix of people, wedding guests still in their formal attire, police officers and medical staff. The bride and groom had insisted on coming, still in their wedding clothes, refusing to continue their celebration while their neighbor's baby fought for life. The contrast between the bride's white dress and the stark hospital environment seemed to emphasize the tragic turn the day had taken. Time moved strangely in that waiting room. Minutes stretched like hours as medical teams worked desperately to save the infant's life. The neighbor's husband sat with his head in his hands, occasionally looking up whenever a doctor passed by. He had loosened his tie and his shirt was wrinkled. He had come straight from an important business meeting to find his world turned upside down. The pediatric nurse who had been at the wedding stayed, still in her floral guest dress, offering her professional insight when she could. She explained medical terms to the family in gentle, understandable ways, helping them grasp what was happening. But even her experienced eyes showed worry as the minutes ticked by without news. Down the hall in the psychiatric wing, the neighbor was receiving her own urgent care. The police officers had handled her transfer to the hospital with remarkable compassion, understanding that they were dealing with a medical emergency rather than a criminal incident. The doctors quickly diagnosed her with severe postpartum psychosis, a condition that had gone unrecognized and untreated for months. The bride's grandfather, who had remained at the hospital, shared with the medical team how the neighbor had changed over recent months. He described her gradual withdrawal from the community, the increasing paranoia, the late-night pacing that neighbors had noticed. Each detail helped the doctors build a clearer picture of a woman who had been silently struggling with a serious mental health crisis. Outside the hospital, news crews began to gather. The story, a wedding interrupted by tragedy, had caught their attention, but the family and friends formed a protective circle, refusing to speak to reporters. They understood that this was not a story for public consumption, but a private tragedy that deserved dignity and respect. The waiting room television played quietly in the background, its cheerful commercials seeming inappropriate against the heavy atmosphere. The groom's father, the retired police officer, kept checking his phone, coordinating with his former colleagues to ensure the neighbor's house was secured and that her pets would be cared for. These small acts of kindness felt inadequate against the magnitude of the situation, but they were all anyone could do while waiting. When the doctor finally appeared, his face told the story before he spoke. Despite every effort, every medical intervention, they had been unable to save the baby. The combination of heat exposure and oxygen deprivation had been too severe. The infant had passed away at 4:47 p.m., less than 2 hours after arriving at the hospital. The news hit the waiting room like a physical force. The bride, who had been holding the groom's hand, let out a small sob. The neighbor's husband collapsed into a chair, his face a mask of disbelief and grief. The pediatric nurse turned away, years of professional experience not enough to prevent her own tears. The police officers who had stayed received the news with heavy hearts. They would now have to modify their reports, transforming this from a mental health emergency into an accidental death investigation. But looking at the devastated family, they knew this was not a case for harsh justice, but for healing and understanding. In the psychiatric wing, the medical team faced the difficult task of telling the neighbor what had happened. They decided to wait until her condition stabilized, understanding that in her current state, the news might shatter what remained of her fragile mental health. Her room was kept under constant observation, the staff watching for any signs of self-harm as she slowly emerged from her psychotic episode. The wedding guests who had remained at the hospital began to leave quietly, each carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. Many stopped to hug the bride and groom, who had chosen to stay, understanding that their presence offered some small comfort to the grieving family. The white wedding dress, now slightly wrinkled from hours of hospital waiting, seemed like a remnant from another lifetime. Hospital social workers arrived, offering grief counseling and support services. They explained the process that would follow, the necessary investigations, the arrangements that would need to be made, the support systems available for both parents. Their quiet professionalism provided a framework for the chaos of grief that was just beginning. As evening fell, the hospital corridor lights flickered on, marking the transition from the hopeful spring day to a night of sorrow. The neighbor's husband struggled with paperwork, his hands shaking as he signed forms he never imagined he would have to sign. The bride's grandfather sat with him, offering silent support, understanding that sometimes presence means more than words. The event would change the community forever. Mental health awareness, particularly regarding postpartum conditions, would become a focus of local attention. The tragedy would prompt discussions about recognizing signs of crisis, about reaching out to isolated neighbors, about the importance of maternal mental health care. The day that had begun with joy and celebration had ended in unimaginable loss. As the last of the wedding guests left the hospital, the contrast between the morning's happiness and the evening's sorrow seemed almost too much to bear. But even in this darkest moment, the community's response, their unity, their compassion, their refusal to judge, showed the deeper bonds that connect people in times of tragedy. The baby's passing marked not just the end of a young life, but the beginning of a long journey of healing for everyone involved. The intersection of celebration and sorrow would remain forever in their memories, a reminder of how quickly life can change and how important it is to care for one another, especially in times of invisible struggle. The days following the tragedy brought both healing and understanding to the small suburban community. The investigation revealed what many had suspected. The neighbor had been suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, a condition that had gone undiagnosed and untreated. Medical records showed she had displayed symptoms during routine checkups, but the signs had been missed or dismissed. The bride and groom quietly rescheduled their wedding for later in the year, but their focus remained on supporting their grieving neighbors. They were among the first to help establish a local support group for new mothers, understanding that their interrupted celebration had revealed a deeper need in their community. The husband struggled with his own guilt, wondering how he had missed the signs of his wife's deteriorating mental health. He spent hours talking with counselors, trying to understand how their life together had unraveled so quickly. His colleagues from work, who had once been frustrated by his frequent absences, now rallied around him, offering support and understanding. The neighbor herself began a long journey of treatment and recovery. The psychiatric team worked carefully to help her process what had happened while managing her condition. When she finally understood the full extent of the tragedy, her grief was devastating. But slowly, with professional help and medication, she began to emerge from the darkness that had consumed her. The local medical community was deeply affected by the events. The hospital where the baby had been taken implemented new screening protocols for postpartum mental health. The pediatric nurse who had been at the wedding became an advocate for maternal mental health awareness, sharing her experience to help medical professionals recognize early warning signs of distress. The police officers involved in the incident worked with mental health professionals to develop better response protocols for similar situations. They understood that their role wasn't just law enforcement, but also protecting vulnerable members of their community. Their experience that day changed how they approached mental health crises. The bride's grandfather, drawing on his counseling background, helped establish a grief support network in the community. He understood that the tragedy had affected not just the immediate family, but also the witnesses, the wedding guests who had watched helplessly as events unfolded. His gentle guidance helped many process their feelings of guilt and helplessness. 6 months after the tragedy, the community gathered for a different kind of ceremony. They planted a small garden in the local park, dedicated to raising awareness about maternal mental health. The garden included a bench where new mothers could sit and find peaceful moments, and information about local support services was discreetly displayed nearby. The neighbor's husband became an unexpected advocate for mental health awareness, particularly focusing on the partners of new mothers. He spoke openly about the importance of recognizing changes in behavior, of taking concerns seriously, of not dismissing emotional struggles as mere baby blues. His courage in sharing their story helped other families seek help before reaching crisis points. The wedding venue, which had witnessed such sorrow, was transformed into a meeting place for new parent support groups. The same backyard where tragedy had struck became a space for healing and connection. The fairy lights that had decorated the wedding now illuminated evening support meetings, creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere for parents seeking help. The bride and groom, when they finally did have their wedding, incorporated a meaningful tribute into their ceremony. They set up a small table with information about maternal mental health resources, turning their celebration into an opportunity for awareness and education. Their guests, many of whom had been present at the first attempted wedding, understood the profound significance of this gesture. Local medical practices began implementing more thorough mental health screening procedures for new mothers. The tragedy had highlighted how easily serious conditions could be overlooked in the busy routine of postnatal care. Regular mental health check-ins became as important as physical examinations. The neighbor slowly began to rebuild her life, though nothing could ever erase the pain of her loss. With treatment and support, she eventually became an advocate for mental health awareness herself, sharing her story to help others recognize the signs she had missed in herself. Her courage in speaking out helped reduce the stigma surrounding postpartum mental health issues. The community learned valuable lessons about watching out for each other. Neighbors became more attentive to signs of struggle in young families. The simple act of checking in on new parents became a community priority. What had once been private struggles became opportunities for connection and support. 1 year after the tragedy, the local hospital opened a new maternal mental health wing, staffed with specialists trained to recognize and treat postpartum mental health conditions. The facility offered both inpatient and outpatient services, ensuring that no other mother would have to struggle alone with undiagnosed mental health issues. The legacy of that spring day lived on in the changes it inspired. While nothing could undo the tragedy that occurred, the community's response showed how loss could lead to understanding and positive change. The story became not just one of tragedy, but of how a community could come together to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. As years passed, the garden in the park flourished, becoming a symbol of hope and healing. New mothers would sit on the memorial bench, sharing their struggles and fears with others who understood. The tragedy had taught the community the importance of speaking openly about mental health, of reaching out to those in need, and of ensuring that no parent had to face their struggles alone. The story of the wedding day tragedy became a powerful reminder of how mental health awareness can save lives. It showed how a community could transform grief into positive action, and how understanding and support could prevent other families from experiencing similar loss. Through education, awareness, and compassion, they had created lasting change from their deepest sorrow.